All right, part 2. So where we left it last lecture is talking about how the success of our species, the ability for our species to thrive in so many different environments, is because we inherit not just one lineage, genes, genetic adaptations to particular environments, but we also inherit an accumulation of cultural information that allows us to actually thrive in a multitude of environments. And I was making the argument that that ability to transmit culture is our greatest psychological adaptation. It is a genetic adaptation. We have become adapted genetically to being able to then transmit culture. And for the last about 100,000 years, probably more, we have been a necessarily cultural species, which is to say that if we were born outside of that cultural lineage, if we did not have access to the accumulated cultural information of the people who'd come before, we would actually not be able to survive anymore, just relying on our genetic adaptations. And a good example of that is cooking, which we talked about last lecture. The way our bodies are now designed, we cannot extract enough nutrition from our ancestral environments without cooking. If you were Tarzan, raised by apes, and you had no one to teach you how to cook, you would not have the guts to be able to develop into those strong gorillas, or whoever it was that Tarzan lived with, because you can't process that same food. You would need the cultural innovations that your own species had developed in order to actually extract sufficient nutrition. So our bodies are born with the expectation now of culture. We need it. Now, those adaptations for transmitting culture rely primarily on this idea of social learning, which we again talked about last lecture. What goes into social learning? A few of the things we talked about before. You need to have intelligence. And in fact, the argument was made in the cultural brain hypothesis that what drove the increase in intelligence, what drove the rapid, massive increase in our brain size was actually this increased selection pressure for the people who are best able to socially learn, who are able to learn from others, roll that information around in their head, and transmit it back to other people. Theory of mind, you could make the same argument, that it was driven by the benefits of social learning. Recall that these levels of intentionality, you can see chimpanzees maybe get up to 2, but then the gap between us and our closest cousin is massive. We get up to 5, maybe 6. So that's another rapid increase that we've experienced. But there are also these specific mechanisms. We have specific mechanisms that make us, to drive us to learn from others and to imitate them. In the Boyd and Richardson and Henrik paper, they talked about how babies, human children, have this tendency to over-imitate what somebody else is teaching them in a way that chimpanzees don't. So if you're showing a chimpanzee and a human child how to do something, going through the motions, the chimpanzees will ignore, to the extent that they can learn this stuff, they will ignore things which seem extraneous, but the humans will over-imitate. Here's an example.
Una, dale, cómpela. Yami, mira. Se cayó. Dale. Ponle el pie. Ayúdala. Una, dos y tres.
Now, I want to talk about these learning and imitation mechanisms for this lecture, but I also want to put on our radar that this comes with a trade-off. So the benefit of this social learning is that you get low-cost cumulative information. And what I mean by low cost means that you don't have to individually learn everything about the environment yourself. That's a high-cost way of doing it. Try out that plant to see if it kills you. Try out that plant, that form of cooking to see if you get adequate nutrition. You don't have to try everything yourself if you can rely on the hundreds and thousands of people who've come before and figured out a lot of these tricks about your environment. So in that sense, learning from other people is low cost. But for the learning, it requires you to be open-minded. It requires you to be credulous, to be gullible about what others are teaching you. For imitating, because we are designed to be a species which looks around and sees what other people are doing and makes a reasonable assumption that that means it's good, we have a tendency to be conformist. That is usually good, but in both of these cases, there are situations in which they misfire. Most of the time these serve us well, but it's very easy to identify those times when they lead us astray. A lot of that is a lot of what social psychology is about. All right, so first let's talk about the broad classes of the mechanisms by which culture is transmitted between people. There are two broad classes. One is content-based mechanisms and the other is context-based mechanisms. So the content-based mechanisms means that a particular type of cultural information, be it a farming technique, be it a way of cooking food, be it a particular religious idea, or whatever, gets passed down better if there's something about the content of the idea that actually makes it more memorable, for instance, makes it easier to understand. So if, for instance, you're trying to, you develop this really great way of tying shoelaces, but it's like really complicated. It takes many steps. It's got all sorts of weird loops going in different directions. It's probably not going to be the one to catch on. Say you have an extremely effective language, but it's very, very hard to learn. It's got a lot of really big words, the grammar is very complicated. For other reasons it might be really good, but it's complicated to learn. Those ideas are at a disadvantage from being passed down because of the content. Instead, a simple way of tying your shoelaces, a easy to understand language, a memorable way of cooking a particular dish. That is something about the content of the recipe that made it easier to remember, and as a result, that information gets better passed down into other minds. The other class, probably the more interesting class, is context-based mechanisms. Nothing about what the idea that's being passed down is itself, but what are the circumstances under which it's being passed down? From whom is it being passed down? And so you can split these into two further subclasses. One is frequency-dependent cultural learning biases. Basically what this means is that we are drawn to ideas which occur frequently in the environment. We are biased towards cultural traits that are exhibited by a large percentage of the rest of the population. That's your conformity thing. We also have model-based cultural learning biases. It's not the number of people exhibiting a particular cultural trait, but it's the specific people. There's specific people that you're drawn to pay attention to. Cultural models, you could say. So imagine this. Imagine that you show up to the first, you're a foreign student, and you show up to the first day of real in-person classes at UBC. And you're trying to figure out, what am I going to wear? I don't want to wear something that's going to make me seem like a loser, it's going to stick out. And so you notice that most people, or at least a high frequency of people, wear blue jeans. That's a pretty safe thing to wear. A lot of people wear blue jeans. So you figure, well, using your frequency-dependent cultural learning bias, you're drawn to the fact that many people wear blue jeans. You wear blue jeans yourself. But then what you realize after being at school for a couple weeks is that the really cool kids, the really popular kids, don't just wear blue jeans, but they wear blue jeans with all these strategic holes cut out in them, and they're sort of properly distressed. And so now, you're drawn both to wearing blue jeans because it's what everybody does, and you're also drawn to wearing a particular type because it's what certain cultural models seem to wear, the cool kids. And so they're modeling what it's like to be a successful member of that little subculture. And as a result, you're drawn to do whatever they do as well. We'll talk about those in more detail. But first, let's go back to talk about the frequency-dependent cultural learning biases. So, imitating what most people do is a good general rule. If most people are doing it, it probably works pretty well, in most cases. So the number of people who do something is a good cue to its success and its social acceptability. It's conforming to whatever the weird social norms might be. So imagine that you went to UBC and you decided you're going to wear a miniskirt. Maybe that's really not socially acceptable. Maybe you'd be shamed if you did it. That's why nobody's doing it. So you decide, well, the safe thing seems to be to wear blue jeans. There's no apparent social norm that I'd be breaking if I were to wear blue jeans, because it's what most other people are doing. So we evolved the conformity bias. As I said, most of the time it serves us well. But the power of the conformity bias is evident when we see how easily we can be tricked to follow it. A lot of these social learning biases are the ultimate explanations for a lot of the proximate phenomena that you may have learnt about in social psychology. So some of you guys might remember Solomon Asch's famous studies on conformity. What he did is he had a bunch of people come into a lab room, and he'd show them a bunch of different lines. And he would ask them, okay, so you see line X, which of these other lines is the same length as line X? But what he'd done is, in the lab room, only one of the subjects was an actual subject of the experiment. The rest of them were all stooges of the experiment. They were all Confederates. And one by one, those Confederates would say, oh, X, yeah, obviously it's C. That's the one that's the same. And then the next guy would go, yeah, C. The next guy would go, C. And then this guy, he'd be really confused because he knows what his eyes see, but then he also sees what everybody else is doing. And so what does he answer? Well, he answers C. That's the power of the conformity bias. Now, those of you who took 102 with me might remember the video, the candid camera video we had of people in the elevator. You had a bunch, basically the same as the Solomon Asch experiment, except that you had a bunch of stooges of the show rotating in the elevator, and you'd see the poor actual person kind of just conforming by, first looking forward in an elevator like a normal person, but then kind of conforming to the pressure. Oh, I guess the social norm has changed and now we're supposed to face the rear of the elevator or face the side of the elevator, whatever. And this conformity in these situations is when people have sought out to deliberately trick it. But it is a way that we fill the social norms of our society. So for instance, this elevator situation has become kind of familiar in my building here. We are required to wear masks in all public places, including the elevator. Oftentimes what will happen, you'll be in the elevator, you're wearing a mask, some other guy's wearing a mask, some person comes in not wearing a mask. And they're kind of looking at you, and then they kind of like, slowly, put my phone away, I'll check my phone, and then I'll take out a mask, and then it's like, I wasn't doing it because of the conformist reason, but I just had it in my pocket or whatever. They are conforming. And in fact, wearing masks is an excellent example of bowing to that social norm pressure for a good reason. But of course, there are also other examples of this. Model-based cultural learning biases are not focusing on what most people are doing, but selectively targeting your attention to individuals who are likely to be able to provide particularly valuable cultural information. So imagine that you are a young guy in a hunter-gatherer society, and you want to figure out how to shoot a good bow and arrow or how to make a good bow and arrow. Who do you pay attention to? Who do you learn from? Who do you imitate? So on the one hand, you could try to see who has the best skill at doing what you're trying to do. Who is it who shoots the most accurate arrows? The problem is it's not always clear how to determine who has the best skill, nor what skills you're actually trying to learn. And so a more general cue that you could pay attention to is success. Who's the most successful person? Who brings home the most meat? But that's also not always super clear. Moreover, instead of just doing the low-cost imitating of somebody who's already done the work of figuring out how things are done, you can actually take it another level. You can piggyback on the work other people have already done to figure out who's the person to pay attention to. And so an even more general cue is to pay attention to that person that the other people are already paying attention to. Because if they're paying attention to that person, they must already know something. They must already know who is worth paying attention to. And that idea is called prestige. Paying attention to the people that other people are paying attention to. This is another psychological trait that we have. Our attention is drawn to those who are already drawing other people's attention. Now, collectively, these learning biases, which again selectively redirect our attention to particular models within the culture, serve as a way of selecting which cultural information actually gets passed down. Because there's a lot of different cultural information that's produced. There are a lot of different people who design a bunch of different types of bow and arrows, who shoot them differently, who cook different food, who eat different things. How do you know if all that plethora of cultural information is the stuff that you should pay attention to? Well, by focusing on these particular learning biases, you are providing a sieve, a filter by which certain information, most likely the highest quality information, gets passed down. All right, now prestige introduced a new concept in our understanding of status. Before prestige bias emerged, the way status existed within dominance hierarchies was, yes, through dominance. So it was the biggest, strongest person who was at the top of the pile, and that person would take their force. Their power came from enforcing their force over others. If somebody threatened them, they would have to either scare them off or bat them down. But prestige is different. Prestige is being on the top of a hierarchy, but for a different reason. You don't take that position from others. Others give it to you. It's not based on force, but it's based on freely given respect. Now, the existence of prestige bias is again one of those things where you have an ultimate explanation which explains a lot of other proximal phenomenon we see in our society. So prestige bias explains celebrity endorsements. Why should I care what watch Leonardo DiCaprio wears? Well, Leonardo DiCaprio is a pretty good model of success in our culture. As a result, I see other people paying attention to him, and I think he must be doing something right. It doesn't matter what his skills are. It doesn't matter if he's a good actor, though I think he is. It doesn't matter that he dates supermodels, though I think he does. But it just matters that he's famous. This Michael Jordan example is another example. This is a dated reference, of course, but I remember this ad from the early 90s, which was all about, it's got to be the shoes. How is Michael Jordan such a great basketball player? Well, it's got to be the shoes. Everybody knew it wasn't the shoes, but did they really know it wasn't the shoes? Because here's how celebrity endorsements work in the context of prestige. Prestige bias compels you to imitate what those cultural models are doing. And what specific thing do you imitate? Not any specific thing. You imitate everything. Why? Because you don't know what it is that gives those people their power. And as a result, you imitate everything. If you see Michael Jordan being somebody that other people are paying attention to, you buy his shoes, or you buy Leo's watch, or you drink Taylor Swift's pop. Prestige bias also explains how people become famous just for being famous. 100 million followers. Now, can anybody tell me why she got those last 50 million followers for any other reason than the fact that she had the first 50 million followers? No, because that's what the prestige bias is. All right, two last points I want to make. Now, one of them was already discussed in the Boyd et al. Paper, but I wanted to go over it just in case it was a little confusing, and that's this frequency dependence of social learners and individual learners. Why you need both. So Boyd made the point that, say there's somebody who learns about something from the environment. This big circle here is the environment. This little square is one person who's learned something from the environment. Then what happens is they go and teach whatever it is that they learned to the rest of the people in their group. So the other people imitate them. But the copying, the imitation, the learning is not at 100% fidelity. People don't learn exactly what it is that that person did. There'll be a slight differentiation. And that's critical, Because say they learned about 95% of what the person taught them. Well, then they go and teach it to another group of people. Imagine this is like a long game of telephone. So the next group of people, say they also learned at a fidelity of 95%. But now what it is it's 95% multiplied by the original 95% of what the original person learned. So you're getting the signal of whatever it is they learned from the environment degraded every generation that you deviate from learning it directly from the environment. So you can see how it's sort of fading. The colors are slightly differentiating from what the actual environmental fact was. And that continues to happen until, well, you end up quite different from what the environment is. What you've now learned from multiple generations of other social learners, from what they learned from the first individual learner, is now a pretty degraded signal. It is quite different. It's non-optimal. Now imagine, because we talked about environmental variability, that the environment now changes. Now you're really misaligned with what the environment is. And so you need an individual learner to go back and learn something anew, actually learn from the environment themselves, rather than learning from doing all the social learning from learning from other people who've only socially learned things themselves. And that person, that's your maverick. That's the person who's actually going and relearning stuff from the environment, not taking the low-cost way of just learning from other people, but taking the high-cost, difficult way of actually learning from the environment, doing the individual learning, as I said. And so then they can teach this new way, this updated way, which better reflects the environment you're now living in, to other members of the group. And as a result, they then teach it, and you get closer to what the environment is in this case. So what that means is that effective social learning will need some mavericks who engage in the asocial individual learning, just to refresh and make sure that things are actually tied, not to what everybody else has learned as this game of telephone, but to the environment itself. The optimal balance on how many maverick individual learners and how many compliant social learners you have depends on the variability of the environment. If it's a rapidly changing environment, like we talked about last class, then it actually calls out for more individual learning, because you have to keep updating your techniques for this changing environment. If the environment's more stable, then what people previously learned 2, 3, 4 generations ago is still valid now, more or less valid. Now, interestingly, this might be one of the explanations as to why you tend to see a difference in conformity and collectivism versus individualism between the East and the West. The East, East Asia, India, that kind of place, had less environmental variability than you saw in the places we associate with the traditional West, Europe. And because of that, the cultural values may have weighed social learning versus individual learning, may have weighed conformity versus individualism and maverickism differently. And in certain circumstances, that's going to offer different costs and benefits. So the United States, in particular certain parts of the United States, say California, have really benefited from very creative people who've been willing to step outside the box, to not conform to the way people are doing things, and to think creatively and strike out in radically new ways. That can be very good, and the US has benefited from that situation. But there's other situations in which conformity and compliance and obedience actually might be more helpful. Now, this is something we're going to return to in the last week of the class, when we talk about the eventual direction, multiple directions that civilization has gone in the past few centuries, rather than talking about the scale of tens and hundreds of thousands of years. All right, the last thing that I wanted to talk about is, despite the value of these mavericks, what the dual inheritance model and what cultural evolution teaches us is how much of a collective enterprise human intelligence is. In Joe Henrich's previous book, The Secret of Our Success, a wonderful book, he talks about how the fruits of cultural evolution are directly proportional to the population size. The larger and more integrated the population of a community is, the more cultural innovations they're able to produce. And as was mentioned in the Boyd paper that you guys read, once a culture falls below a certain population threshold, like which happened with Tasmania when it was cut off from the rest of Australia, they tend to lose their cultural innovations. And what that suggests is that human accomplishment in cultures is not built on individual genius, but it is produced by the small incremental contributions of average people that aggregate up over 100 generations or 1,000 generations. In a previous lecture, I said that we were going to figure out how our species became one that could understand the theory of evolution. Well, it wasn't enough to produce Charles Darwin's brain, because he didn't figure it out alone. No brain did. No brain even could. Darwin, as I mentioned, was the beneficiary of having a lot of the pieces of evolutionary theory already in the air when he was doing his own thinking. Darwin stood on many shoulders. He stood on the shoulders of his grandfather Erasmus Darwin, and on the shoulders of Thomas Malthus and Lamarck and Immanuel Kant, and countless other small contributors whose names have been forgotten to history, but whose small contributions actually were necessary to build that greatest idea to ever pass through a human mind. And that's actually how the theory of evolution was produced. It was a cultural innovation. It was a cultural production rather than just the product of a single mind. And that's how really anything man-made is produced. That's how this mouse is produced. That's how the little love machines that we call dogs have been produced, by breeding decisions by millions of individuals over 15,000 years. That's how societies are built. They're not the product of these singular lone geniuses who push the whole society forward in terms of these quantum leaps. Instead, they are millions of hands and millions of minds all adding their little brick into this collective enterprise. Everyone contributes to and benefits from this grand human project.